Thanks, Kaylee. And you can watch our full interview with Congressman King on CBSNews.com. If it weren't for the oil spill and the Times Square bomber, we'd probably be talking about the president's next Supreme Court nominee. Obama has been meeting with his potential choices, and our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, has been following all of these developments. Hello, Jan. Before we start on the Supreme Court, I want to get your reaction to Congressman King.
Oh, well, it was almost like we were listening to two different people. You know, at the end of the interview, it was striking, I thought, that he's complaining about the leaks of all of this information that we've gotten and all the sensitive information. But at the beginning of Kaylee's interview, he's complaining that, well, we read his Miranda rights, and so we're not going to be getting that information. So it's kind of hard to square those two things. I think the takeaway from this interview and from this issue, though, is that this has been a very effective moment for this administration as they're trying to decide whether or not they are going to read these suspect Miranda rights, which of course was a huge issue after the arrest of the would-be Christmas Day bomber. This shows, I think we're going to start hearing now from this White House, that law enforcement tools work, that we need to be able to have our whole toolbox of tools to question these suspects and not just put them in military commissions and not just turn them over to the military. If you look at what the FBI has done here, they've been very effective. So I think the storyline that you're going to start seeing from the White House is that this shows we need all of those law enforcement tools and not taking them away. Right,
the system can handle it. All right, so now let's move on to the Supreme Court. The president's got a list. First question is, how big is the list, and who's he been meeting with?
Well, you know, they started out with this really big list of, 9 or 10, and then they were saying, well, there may be more, but he's interviewed now 4 candidates for the seat to replace Justice John Paul Stevens, the liberal leader of that Supreme Court. Obviously, this is a momentous nomination, and it's a fascinating short list of 4 that he seems to be focusing on. Now, my guidance is he's not necessarily done with the interviews, but we can look at these 4 because they are a real range of candidates. I think the front runner so far from the beginning still is Elena Kagan. Now, she's the Solicitor General. She argues the administration's position in the United States Supreme Court. The justices are very familiar with her. She's very comfortable in that building. She was the former dean of Harvard Law School. She's not considered a strong liberal. And so there are some on the left who are not happy with the idea of a Justice Kagan.
And let me interrupt quickly there. How problematic is that? You know, the left, both parties, the wings make a lot of noise, and then it doesn't turn out to be that much of a thing. How much of a problem?
This would not be a Harriet Miers.
Okay,
you're not going to see the left, as the right did when Myers was nominated, explode, because that was issues of competency and qualifications. There's no question that Kagan is brilliant. She's competent. She would be an effective justice on that Supreme Court. The only issue is whether or not she's liberal enough. Liberals see this as Barack Obama's moment. It's never going to get any better than this. Right. He's got 59 votes in that Senate. If Justice Ginsburg goes next year, Democrats are probably going to lose, 4 to 7 seats in the midterms. So this is as good as it's going to get. So they want him to go as strong as he possibly can, and that would be Diane Wood, who was also interviewed. She was on the short list the last time, just like Elena Kagan was, interviewed last year when he picked Sonia Sotomayor. She's considered the most liberal of the 4 he's interviewed. She would be the most controversial, the biggest fight. She's got some controversial abortion decisions, so she'd make the left happy, but she'd give the right a lot more to work with. And so that raises the big question, does this president want to expend political capital, which, as you know, John, is limited when he's got a whole legislative agenda that he wants to push through on a Supreme Court fight? And if the answer is no, and if he wants to just cave and say, I don't really want to spend any political capital.
He wants an easy summer.
Then it's Merrick Garland.
Okay.
And he's also been interviewed. He's a federal appeals court judge here in D.C., considered moderate on criminal issues. I would be, and he very well could be the nominee, the left would be just out of their minds because he is much more moderate. And again, with 59 votes in the Senate, replacing John Paul Stevens, Merrick Garland would be the one you would nominate when you're in the minority in the Senate and you're replacing a conservative. So the left is saying, why do him now?
And is there any thinking, or is it just sort of parlor game thinking, that you keep Garland kind of in your back pocket for that later situation you talk about?
So why would you do Garland now? 59 votes in the Senate, you're replacing a liberal, you're not replacing a conservative, you're not changing the balance of the court. Why would you run the risk? Again, I hate to keep saying this, but you do have 59 votes. Why would you run the risk of making this Supreme Court more conservative than it was before Barack Obama went into the White House?
And then who's that last person on the short list?
Okay, this is our big wild card. And this, I think, is a really unknown, outside the Beltway guy named Judge Sidney Thomas from the Ninth Circuit. He's not even that well known in legal circles.
In his own family.
But he's from Montana. Right. And, you know, he's rugged, and he's got a beard, and he looks, you know, like a really everyday anti-Washingtonian guy. And he would be the purest political pick. So if we get Judge Thomas as the nominee, that means this fight is all about politics, not about how it's going to affect the court, not about a strategic pick on which justice is going to be building coalitions. He is the one who can be the tool Obama, the President Obama, can use to say the Supreme Court's out of touch with everyday Americans. Republicans are out of touch with everyday Americans. We need a good populist like Sidney Thomas from Montana who can stand in the shoes of regular people like you and me and get outside the Beltway where, you know, the real people live.
And does that then link up with the storyline they've been pushing about the Citizens United case?
Absolutely. That plays perfectly into that, you know, this whole populist narrative that we heard, of course, in that historic State of the Union swipe that the president took at the justices, and they've kind of continued to beat that drum, pick the fight with the Supreme Court, that the court's just out of touch. So he would be the best to further that, because the other three that we've been talking about are real insiders. They're federal appeals court judges, they're part of the establishment, they're Ivy Leaguers, with the exception of Diane Wood, who, by the way, is a University of Texas grad, so she's got a little outside the Beltway cred. Big 12, you know, it's got a lot of support there. I think Kay Bailey Hutchinson, John Cornyn. They're Longhorns fans. That
larger argument about being sort of more populist is also obviously their political argument on a whole host of other things, Wall Street and
right. So they can use these confirmation hearings as you're going into the midterm to further this narrative that they are the party of the people.
On the Sidney Thomas question, then, does anybody on the left make the argument the right does when you have an unknown pick, which is the Souter question?
No.
Will he turn into something else?
No, the left is very supportive of him, and this is why I think when you're graphing out, if you're in the White House, graphing out, you know, who's the best you're going to get, furthers your political ambitions, and also is going to be the least fight. He's got some very liberal and very controversial opinions on social issues, a couple of which were overturned unanimously by the Supreme Court. So Republicans could, in some ways, have an easier time going against him than someone like a Diane Wood. You know, who's a very accomplished woman, a working mother. She's had some controversial decisions, but she's got a lot of conservative support out there in the Seventh Circuit with those conservative judges like Frank Easterbrook and Richard Posner, University of Chicago. Right. So he, in some ways, oddly enough, Mr. Montana could end up being Mr. Big controversy.
Right, no gender or race barriers. Let me ask you then, as a final question, is there anything we learn about the president from what signals they're giving us? Sometimes those signals they give us about what he's got in his head when he's making these picks are all baloney, meant to kind of deal with that political question. But what's your sense of how he's weighing this and what's in his head?
That is a great question, and this is why I think this nominee is going to be incredibly telling about President Obama's views on the role of the Supreme Court. If you look back at what he said about the court, and I've talked to him about this, he said that he thinks liberals really overstepped when they put all their stock in the Supreme Court and in the courts to change policy, and that should be done in the legislatures, right? Mm-hmm. So if he nominates someone, say like a Merrick Garland or even a Sidney Thomas, that's less a strategic pick, that's less about the court, less of a fight. That lets him say, the court's just not as important to me as an agent of change, and it's my legislative agenda that I want to get through. That's where I think the real rubber needs to hit the road. And I think that's a really significant statement from the president. We went into this, and I certainly did, thinking that he's this former constitutional law scholar. He's the one, and last year he made a political pick with Sotomayor, and Sidney Thomas certainly would be a political pick. Garland would be someone who's not a fight. So I think this pick will be very, very telling about his views on the role of the Supreme Court.
That's great, Jan. Thank you so much.